Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this idea of childlike faith. You know how it's presented in the Bible.
Yeah.
You've given us some excerpts from Luke, chapter 18, verses 15 through 17.
Right.
And then some historical anecdotes to kind of go along with it.
Yeah, a fascinating combination.
Yeah, it is interesting. And it really gets to, I think, what it means to approach faith with that childlike perspective.
It does.
But verse 17 really stands out to me. It says, "Truly, I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." But what does it mean
What does that actually mean?
to have that faith?
Yeah.
Like a little child.
That is the question, isn't it? That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The text doesn't explicitly define it, and so it leaves us with a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
And that's where these historical figures you've provided come in.
Yes. So we've got Johann Trebonius,
Yes.
this German teacher who always tipped his hat to his students,
Yes.
even though they were just kids.
He did. And, he had a reason for doing so, a very powerful reason.
Yeah.
He saw in them the potential for greatness,
Oh, wow.
the possibility that one of them might go on to achieve amazing things.
Yeah.
And as we know, one of his students did become quite influential, Martin Luther.
Yeah, a key figure in the Reformation.
Absolutely, a key figure in the Reformation.
Yeah. It's amazing to think that he was able to see that potential when others might have just seen, a classroom full of kids.
Yeah, just children.
Yeah.
It speaks to a deep respect for the unknown, a willingness to see beyond the surface and acknowledge the inherent worth of each individual.
And then you also found the story of James Garfield,
Yes.
who would always greet this newsboy that he would pass on the street.
He would.
And when asked why, he said, because no one knows what's hidden in that boy's heart.
Isn't that a beautiful sentiment?
It is. It really is.
It points to the idea that every person, regardless of their social standing or their current circumstances, carries within them a spark of divinity.
Yeah.
A potential for something extraordinary.
It's like they both embodied that verse from Luke. They were receiving these children,
Right.
these seemingly ordinary people, as potential inheritors of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like, in practice?
Right.
How does that translate into the way we live our lives?
Well, I think if we take a closer look at the biblical passage itself,
Okay.
it's nestled between some pretty powerful parables, and I think that might give us some clues.
You're talking about the persistent widow and the Pharisee and the tax collector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The parable of the persistent widow who just keeps pestering this unjust judge until he finally grants her request. It seems to highlight the importance of relentless, unwavering faith.
Huh.
It's like a child who keeps asking their parent for something, completely convinced that they'll eventually get it.
So even when it feels like our prayers aren't being answered,
Right.
we should keep asking, keep believing.
That seems to be the message.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating that childlike trust that our needs will be met even if it doesn't happen on our timeline or in the way we expect.
And then there's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector.
Yes.
What a stark contrast in attitudes.
It really is.
All right.
The Pharisee, so focused on his own piety.
Yeah.
He boasts about all the good deeds he's done.
Mm-hmm.
But the tax collector, considered a sinner by society, humbly acknowledges his shortcomings and begs for mercy.
So it's not about trying to be perfect.
No.
Or earn God's favor.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Childlike faith is about recognizing our need for grace
Uh-huh.
and approaching God with humility.
Yeah.
Like a child admitting they've broken a rule.
Right.
They know they've done wrong,
Uh-huh.
but they still trust that their parent loves them unconditionally.
That's a powerful analogy.
It is.
And speaking of things that might be difficult to let go of,
Yes.
you also pointed out the story of the rich young ruler
Yeah.
in Luke 18.
He just couldn't bring himself to give up his wealth to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
It really highlights the challenge of attachment, and how it can hinder our ability to fully embrace faith.
Yeah, it almost seems like he was letting his possessions define him
Right.
rather than allowing himself to be defined by his relationship with God.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that true freedom comes from detaching ourselves from material things and finding our security in something greater.
And that brings us back to Trebonius and Garfield,
It does.
who saw potential where others might have seen limitations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were willing to embrace the unknown, to see beyond the surface, and recognize the inherent worth of each individual.
It's a beautiful example of what it means to have faith in something bigger than ourselves.
It is.
So this childlike faith seems to be about more than just a feeling or a set of beliefs.
Right.
It's a way of seeing the world.
That is
a way of
sick.
interacting with others.
That's precisely.
Yeah.
It's about approaching life with a sense of wonder, humility, and trust qualities we often associate with children, but which can be so easily lost in the complexities of adulthood.
Yeah. But what about this kingdom of God
Right.
that Jesus keeps referring to?
Sure.
What does that have to do with childlike faith?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely delve into further.
Okay.
The kingdom of God is central to understanding the message of Jesus, and childlike faith seems to be the key to unlocking its mysteries.
Okay, so let's unlock those mysteries. So how does this idea of childlike faith connect to this idea of the kingdom of God?
What's a fascinating connection,
Yeah.
The kingdom of God isn't a physical place,
Right.
but rather a way of being,
Okay.
a state of existence where God's will is done and his love reigns supreme.
And you're saying that childlike faith is kind of the key to experiencing this kingdom?
It seems so, yeah.
Okay.
If we look at the parables, we see glimpses of this kingdom in action.
Uh-huh.
In the parable of the persistent widow, for example.
Mhm.
Jesus highlights the relentless nature of God's love and his willingness to answer our prayers.
It's like that saying, knock and the door will be opened.
Exactly, but it's not just about asking.
Right.
It's about trusting, like a child trusts their parent to provide for their needs.
Yeah.
That unwavering faith is what allows us to enter into the kingdom.
And then there's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector.
Yes.
The tax collector, despite being seen as a sinner,
Right.
was the one who went home justified in God's eyes.
This parable really challenges our assumptions about what it means to be worthy of God's love.
Yeah.
It's not about our outward actions
Right.
or our perceived righteousness,
Yeah.
but rather about our humility and our willingness to acknowledge our need for grace.
So in a way, the tax collector's humility was a reflection of the kingdom of God
Yeah.
because he was acknowledging that he wasn't in control, that he needed something beyond himself.
That's a brilliant insight. It's that surrender, that letting go of our ego and our need to be perfect that opens us up to the transformative power of God's grace.
And isn't that a characteristic of children?
It is.
They're not afraid to ask for help.
Yeah.
They haven't yet learned to pretend that they have it all figured out.
Precisely. And that's something we can learn from them.
Yeah.
Childlike faith isn't about being naive or childish. It's about embracing those qualities of humility, vulnerability, and dependence
Right.
that allow us to experience the fullness of God's love.
And what about the rich young ruler? His story seems to be kind of a cautionary tale about the dangers of attachment.
Absolutely. His inability to let go of his wealth prevented him from fully embracing the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that anything we prioritize over a relationship with God can become an obstacle to experiencing true freedom and joy.
So childlike faith involves a willingness to let go of our attachments,
Yes.
our need to control our desire for security and material things.
It does.
It's about trusting that God will provide for our needs, even if it's not in the way we expect.
It's a radical way of living, one that goes against our natural instincts.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
When we surrender to God's will, we're freed from the burden of trying to manage everything ourselves.
It's almost like we're invited to become children again,
Yes.
to see the world with fresh eyes, to embrace the unknown with a sense of wonder and excitement.
And to remember that the kingdom of God isn't something we earn or achieve.
Right.
It's a gift freely given to those who are willing to receive it with open hearts and childlike trust.
But how do we reconcile this idea of childlike faith with the reality of sin and suffering in the world?
Right.
Children are often shielded from the harsh realities of life.
Yeah.
How can we maintain that sense of innocence and trust when we're faced with, pain and disappointment?
The profound question, and one that really gets to the heart of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Childlike faith isn't about ignoring the darkness or pretending that everything is perfect.
Right.
It's about trusting that even in the midst of suffering, God is present and working for our good.
It's like that verse from Romans that says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose.
Exactly. Childlike faith allows us to see beyond the immediate circumstances
Yeah.
and trust in the bigger picture, even when we don't fully understand it.
So it's not about denying the reality of pain or suffering.
No.
But rather about choosing to trust in God's goodness and love, even when it's hard.
And remembering that God himself experienced suffering in the person of Jesus.
Right.
He knows our pain intimately and walks with us through it.
This brings to mind the tax collector again.
Yes.
He didn't try to hide his sinfulness or pretend he was worthy. He came before God with humility and honesty.
And it was in that moment of vulnerability that he experienced God's mercy and forgiveness.
Yeah.
Childlike faith isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest about our struggles and trusting that God's love is big enough to cover them all.
So even when we mess up, even when we fall short, we can still come to God with open hands like a child seeking comfort and reassurance from their parent.
That's the beauty of grace. It wipes the slate clean and gives us a fresh start.
Yeah.
And that's something we can always rely on no matter what life throws our way.
So how do we actually cultivate this childlike faith?
Right.
It sounds beautiful in theory, but how do we put it into practice in our everyday lives? So how do we actually cultivate this childlike faith? It sounds beautiful in theory, but how do we put it into practice in our everyday lives?
Well, it's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
And like any journey, it begins with a single step.
Uh-huh.
One way to start is by simply observing children.
Observing children.
Yes, watch how they interact with the world.
Okay.
Their sense of wonder, their curiosity, their willingness to ask why.
Yeah.
These are all qualities that can help us reconnect with that childlike part of ourselves that may have become dormant over time.
It's like they haven't yet learned to be cynical or jaded.
Right.
They see the world with fresh eyes.
Exactly. Instead of dismissing your questions as silly or naive, try to see the world through their eyes.
Okay.
Embrace that sense of wonder and possibility. Pay attention to the simple things, the beauty of nature, the kindness of strangers, the small miracles that happen every day.
So it's about being more present, more mindful of the gifts that surround us.
And more open to the unexpected.
Oh.
Children are naturally curious and adventurous. They're not afraid to try new things to explore the unknown.
Right.
We can cultivate that same spirit of adventure in our own lives by stepping outside of our comfort zones,
Yeah.
by embracing new experiences, by being willing to learn and grow.
That makes sense. But what about the trust aspect of childlike faith?
Yeah.
How do we learn to trust more deeply, especially when we've been hurt or disappointed in the past?
That's a valid concern. Trust is a fragile thing, and it can be difficult to rebuild once it's been broken.
Right.
But it's not impossible.
Okay.
One way to cultivate trust is to start small. Choose to trust in the small things, a friend's promise, a coworker's, help a stranger's directions. As you experience faithfulness in these small interactions, it can build your capacity to trust in bigger things.
Yeah.
Including your relationship with God.
So it's about practicing trust.
Yes.
Like a muscle that gets stronger with use.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that trust isn't about having all the answers or guarantees.
Right.
It's about choosing to believe even when we don't fully understand or when things don't go as planned.
And that brings us back to surrender.
It does.
Letting go of our need to control.
Yeah.
Accepting that we don't have all the answers and trusting that God has a plan even when we can't see it.
Surrender is a key element of childlike faith.
Yeah.
It's about releasing our grip on the illusion of control and allowing ourselves to be led by something bigger than ourselves. And that can be scary, but it's also incredibly liberating.
Because when we surrender to God, we're essentially saying, I trust you even when I don't understand. It's like a child jumping into their parents' arms knowing they'll be caught.
What a beautiful image.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that we're not alone on this journey. God is always with us, offering his love, guidance, and support. All we have to do is open our hearts and receive it.
This whole conversation has been so enlightening. I feel like I'm starting to see the world in a new light with a sense of wonder and possibility that I haven't felt in a long time.
That's the power of childlike faith.
Yeah.
It allows us to experience the world with fresh eyes, to see God's hand at work in all things, and to live with a sense of joy and purpose, even in the midst of challenges.
It's a reminder that the kingdom of God is here and now available to those who are willing to receive it with open hearts and childlike trust.
And that maybe, just maybe, the key to unlocking the mysteries of life and faith lies within the heart of a child.
That's something to ponder. What stands out to you after this deep dive? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring.